Continued with the Oversoul 7 trilogy, Chapter 4, The Descent of Proteus. Proteus had been aware of his emotional pull toward the earth for as long as he could remember. It was shared by practically no one. None of his school friends showed the slightest interest during the long afternoons when they sat in their separate living areas for television classes, and when they chatted back and forth via video during discussion periods, Earth was hardly ever mentioned. They did talk about going outside when school was over, and the sets turned off, but none of them seemed to realize that outside wasn't really outside. Of course, the plastic trees were replicas of real ones, and the shade they provided was real enough, but the steadily illuminated inner sky beneath the dome was never that bright. Shade wasn't needed that badly. It was just for effect. No birds flew over the branches either, and no matter how well cared for the trees were, they always looked artificial to him. It seemed sometimes as if he knew better, that in some forgotten past he'd known real trees and would never be satisfied with fake ones, which was impossible, of course. The floating cities were held in place by atomically powered motors that automatically compensated for any drift relative to particular designated points on Earth. No one alive remembered the time when people lived on Earth in any numbers, and there had never been real trees in the domed city complexes. But despite this, he dreamed frequently of Earth as it used to be. He felt angry on its behalf. They'd simply abandoned it, given it up. He began devouring the microfilms that were available from the vast video library. Often he sat up late at night, secretly watching the films until morning. His excitement grew with his knowledge. There were various outposts on Earth, archaeological sites and diggings, several scientific installations, and, he suspected, a few back-to-nature communities that somehow eluded satellite surveillance. He couldn't be sure of this, he told himself for the 100th time, but it was a possibility. He began to gather supplies weeks in advance of his plan. His mother had an administrative position, coming home only a few weekends in a 6-month period, so hiding his intent from her was no problem. Maintaining secrecy in the face of his father's almost constant presence was something else again. Mythius was a group father, though, keeping track of some 30 boys and girls on closed-circuit television, overseeing their studies and scheduled activities. Seeing his father so engaged always made Proteus angry. Why couldn't classes be in one big school nodule as they had in the ages past? This afternoon, though, every thought but one fled from Proteus's concern. Each Tuesday, he and his friend Greg went hiking, an activity favored by almost everyone to ensure sufficient muscular and motor development. This Tuesday would be different, though, from any other. Proteus thought that Greg would sense his excitement the minute they met, no matter how he tried to hide it. But Greg just walked beside him, talking as usual about everyday events. Everything Proteus did or said himself seemed unnatural and suspicious to him. He kept throwing sideways glances at Greg, sure that he'd somehow given himself away, but Greg obviously saw nothing different about the day or about Proteus. He'd taken their lunch as usual, out of sheer nervousness. Proteus suggested that they see which of the two could eat them the quickest. So they went down the plastic streets, whooping and laughing, popping the lunch pills in their mouths as fast as possible. They each had 2 protein basics, 2 carbohydrate simples, and an amino acid supplement. Proteus let Grek win because he felt guilty about hiding his plants from him, and he was feeling guiltier each minute. The game had been foolish, too, he thought. It would be the last time he'd gobble his LPs so nonchalantly, so sure of a constant supply. Had he stashed away enough of them? He was sure he had. Still, "You sure are quiet," Grek said. "Oh, it's the same thing," Proteus said. "Walking down these streets depresses me, though I know it shouldn't. And I keep wishing boys were given the same training that girls are, taken into the heart of business and politics at a young age so they see how the world works. If we were girls, we'd be studying seriously at our age, not just passively, watching our fathers manage the living nodules or learning unimportant mundane skills." Actually, Proteus was surprised at the normal sound of dissatisfaction in his voice. Because he was only talking for something to say, but he wasn't concerned with problems like that anymore. Not him. A few boys went by on arrow skis. A man sat on the porch of a nodule, his face expressionless as they passed by. "See," Proteus said, "he looks as artificial as the trees." "Well, not really. My father knows him. He's got as much responsibility as any man around here. But it just isn't enough. He manages rain regulation, but it's all computerized anyway." "Oh, don't start on that stuff again," Grek said. "My father says you will end up in real trouble. You're so damn dissatisfied all the time." This sent Proteus into a laughing fit. "If you only knew," he said. "I mean, how funny that is. What kind of trouble can you get into around here?" "I don't know," Grek said uneasily. "That's it, none," Proteus went on. His talk was supposed to keep Grek occupied while he went over his last-minute plans. As the time approached for him to make his move, he was getting more and more nervous. Soon Grek would suggest that they return. As usual, they'd be expected home before supper, and they'd been walking around about 2 hours. It was near 6 p.m. Would he miss his father? Grek? Wasn't there something he could say to Grek without giving the whole thing away? Something that Grek could remember afterward. "Grek, we're friends, aren't we? Look, I like you a lot." Grek stopped and stared at him. "What did you need to say that for? Sure, we're friends." "I don't know." Proteus felt like laughing, like crying. He felt secretive, yet like shouting his secret aloud where everyone could hear it. He caught himself. He needed the 2-hour head start. He had to get to the ramp that he'd staked out. He said nonchalantly, "Let's go back a different way." He paused and looked around as if trying to make up his mind which way to take. Actually, he was taking a long last look at the neighborhood in which he'd lived as long as he remembered. The living nodules stretched as far as he could see. Each complex was a duplication of ancient Earth conditions, as perfect as art and science could make it. Each city was done in the decor of a particular Earth period. This one was 19th century America. He lived in the Ohio block. "We always go home the way we came," Grek said. Excuse me. I know, but the lunch race gave me an idea. Let's each take a different route to my nodule and see who gets there first. I will go a block to the left. You go a block to the right. It's just an idea, if you don't want to. Proteus broke off. He knew Grek would agree. Any kind of challenge was always fun. All right, ready, set, go, shouted Grek. He turned around without looking back and began to run as fast as he could to the right. Shocked, Proteus just stood there for a moment. He hadn't realized that Grek would take off so quickly, or that there wouldn't be time to make some gesture, some veiled goodbye. Grek disappeared around the corner. Proteus began to run himself, going faster and faster now, stopping only when he had to catch his breath. The slightly springy material of the sidewalk gave just a trifle with each step, so that he felt an added sense of exhilaration, as if he was running so quickly that he could just take off above the treetops. His feet were strangely cold, although the air was maintained at a constant 73.2 degrees, and his heart was pounding. When he finally came out onto the 5-acre area of artificial trees and fields that surrounded the city complex, benches were neatly placed around the landscape, each with one bush beside it and a pot full of simulated flowers. Now, at supper time, the area was vacant. Some of the flowers were growing brittle. Scientists were working on a new material that might actually reproduce itself, or at least repair itself, maintaining a more natural look. Proteus wondered if he'd ever come back, and if he did, whether or not the new plastic life would replace the old. A week ago, he'd carefully cut out a whole chunk of grass and placed his survival kit and supplies beneath it. Now he retrieved them hurriedly. It would be dark at 7 when the daylights automatically lowered to minimum illumination. A panicky feeling flickered behind his forehead. Ignoring it, he inflated his aeroskis, put his survival kit over his back, and glided through the quiet air. The skis worked by reacting against the air beneath them. His were a boy's set, allowing only an elevation of 6 feet, but they could go fast enough. He was too much in a rush now to enjoy sky skiing, as he usually did, but his love of the sport paid off. He was an expert at riding the soft eddies of regulated air that rose and fell, and the skis could go almost 30 miles an hour. The light began to dim to early twilight. It would last for 45 minutes. He wasn't nearly as obvious as he would have been in maximum daylight, and if anyone saw him, he just looked like a boy sky skiing. If you didn't happen to notice his direction, because now he was heading away from the complex. In another half hour, he was at his destination. He floated down, deflated the skis, and tied them around his waist, just as the inner sky turned to natural light. The ramp entrance had taken him months to discover. Now it was only 10 minutes away. No one came to this area except maintenance crews. Here, no effort had been made to decorate. A series of gray, sprawling plastoid buildings stood silently. He reached the ramp entrance. None of them were guarded. No one but the women crews used them to begin with. Proteus stood uncertain. Soon, Grek would wonder what had happened to him. His father would be worried. Should he go back while he could? Was he doing the right thing? His eyes stung. Boys rarely even competed in the examination for historical training, since it was a woman's field. His father said they rewrote history, but he'd tried and flunked. If they had taken him, he probably never would have decided to strike out on his own, to discover Earth on his own. He would have been content with the records. Remembering His resolve came back with a warm rush. The grating was beneath him. He pulled it up easily. It was made for women's lighter hands, and closed it from inside. Quietly he began to descend the dimly lighted ladder-like stairs. His steps echoed through the aluminum tunnel. His scalp prickled and his ears rang. Just suppose that he couldn't get out at the lower end and someone locked the upper entrance. "You're just acting like a scared kid," he told himself scornfully. He knew that the ramps only extended a few hundred feet, yet it seemed that the steps would never end. There were other ramps, but many were used to transport scientific supplies, and he didn't know their schedules. That's why he'd chosen a utility ramp, because they were visited only several times a year for inspection purposes. But now it occurred to him that if anything happened and he couldn't get out, it would be a long time until he was found. Not that he didn't have enough supplies, he told himself quickly, because he did. He was just nervous because he couldn't have known ahead of time how he'd feel. The descent was oddly distasteful. He felt like one of the archaic-looking insects he'd seen in microfilms, creeping inside the huge ramp that descended from the underside of the city. Maybe it was just the knowledge that each step took him nearer the ramp's end that bothered him, he thought. To be continued. Thank you.